You're good.
Ready, sync, clap. If you're in the market for a sub $10,000 compact cinema camera, well, I've got a treat for you because we have 4 of the hottest compact cinema cameras on the market right now. The brand new Panasonic EVA-1, the Canon C200, the Sony FS5, and the URSA Mini Pro. Now, I have done a previous comparison video where we pitted the URSA Mini Pro against the FS7 Mark II and the C300 Mark II. And in the start of that video, I said that I wasn't going to do any image comparisons in that because by the time it gets uploaded to YouTube and the compression, and I don't even know if I have a calibrated monitor, I don't know if you have one, so it wasn't really fair, I thought, to the manufacturers and fair to you. But I think that there are some new things that are happening with these cameras that are warranting some image comparisons that you do need to see. So we're going to do a bunch of those in this video. But I want to tell you what this video isn't. And there's so much to each individual camera. They're so intricate that we could do an hour-long video on each camera. I just want to show you where each one of these cameras fit into your production in terms of, what camera is better for what situation and what camera might be better for another situation. And hopefully you get a sense of that by the end. We are going to start with the image comparisons, and then after that we're going to go into the handling and the buttons, and hopefully by the end of this you'll get a really good sense of which camera is right for you or right for the productions that you do. So without further ado, let's get going and jump right into the image comparisons. So first up is sharpness. One of the advantages of 4K acquisition is the ability to punch in and effectively get 2 camera angles for the price of 1. But when you punch in, not all cameras resolve detail in the exact same way. So what we did is we set up on the street corner near the store here and pointed it at what I thought showed a good amount of detail, shingles, a tree, and then we just punched in 200%. 2 of these cameras feature sensors that resolve above 4K. That is the URSA Mini Pro at 4.6K and the new EVA-1 at 5.7K. Now the EVA is a little bit different because it throttles the output to 4K. And what it does instead is use the extra pixels to deliver true 4K after the debayering. When we punch in to 200%, it's immediately obvious which camera is the EVA. I'm actually a little surprised that the 4.6K URSA doesn't really show much advantage over the FS5. But what's obvious is how soft the C200 is. We could go in and we could turn up internal sharpening, but we'll probably still see less sharpness than the FS5. So before we declare the EVA the overall winner here, we do have to consider that sharpness is not always desirable. And a lot of users have shied away from Sony over the years because they felt the image was too sharp. And where we see this the most is that cinematic and softness often tend to go hand in hand. And when you're shooting a lot of skin tones, like in beauty spots or in interviews, that you do want a certain level of skin rendition that's not too sharp. So what we're going to see is how these cameras perform when we look at skin tone, both in color and in detail. What I noticed first up with the C200 is that it has really nice highlights. It doesn't really get too specular on her cheekbones or on her forehead, so the softness plays really, really nice on the skin tones. I'm not totally crazy about the magenta shift, but obviously that's a quick fix in post, and I'd probably shoot C-Log 3 anyways for commercial beauty work, and I'd probably even shoot RAW, so that's totally fine. It's not really an issue. So moving on to the EVA, we do see that it is quite a bit harsher. The sharpness possibly playing a role here, but the colors are really great and there's no blotchiness. I would probably turn the sharpness way down in camera, and what the EVA does have is they have this skin detail setting that presumably does this. We went into the skin detail, but it wasn't clear what it was doing, and no amount of Googling or looking into the manual actually explained what skin detail does. So we shot a couple different skin details, and some look sharper, some look softer. I think you're just going to have to experiment and figure it out for yourself. It is going to take the sharpness of the whole image down, so what might be best is to leave the sharpness in and then in post-production individually soften the skin tones in your color grade. So for the FS5, I used the Cine PP5 profile, which is their hyper gamma. And I'm still not crazy about the colors. The highlights on her skin just feel a bit clippier than others despite the better range of the PP5. And this is typical with Sony for me, is that Sony has really outrageous sort of reds to oranges to yellows, and then we could be seeing some of that in her skin right now. And finally, moving on to the URSA, the skin texture with the URSA is really good, but the colors I find are still a bit more aggressive and maybe a bit blotchier. That said, the color and the contrast of the video profile, complemented by the softness of the URSA sensor, seems to be most favorable to nice, soft, and pleasing skin tones. So the winner on this one's a bit of a toss-up for me. I really like the skin detail of the C200, but I'm not crazy about the amount of work I might have to do in post to correct out some of those colors. If you want a little bit more sharpness or a faster turnaround in the grade, then the URSA Mini Pro is probably the one for you. And both of these cameras actually shoot RAW internally, so you get a lot of latitude in post and a lot of ability to manipulate skin tone, colors, and texture and that type of thing. If you do want to shoot with the FS5 or the EVA-1 with skin tone, I would probably recommend, instead of doing internal sharpness, that you buy like a 1/8 Pro Mist filter. We do this in beauty work all the time, and some of the best cameras in the world will still be fitted with like a 1/8 or 1/4 Pro Mist in order to kind of smooth out those skin tones. And that's a really great way of being able to use these super sharp cameras. Next up is log profiles. To get the most dynamic range out of these cameras, which is pretty incredible, they have like 14 to 15 stops of dynamic range, you do need to shoot in a log profile. And what log is going to do is it's really going to compress down those highlights and kind of keep everything in the middle. And then in post, you're going to be able to like unpack that image. Now, there is a difference in terms of how each one of these grade in post and what you can kind of do with them. And that's what I really wanted to explore, was not so much like which handled dynamic range the best, but once you got it into your color suite, how quick can you turn it around into a usable image? So what I did is I broke the grade up into 3 different types of grades. One where I just simply apply a classic log to Rec. 709 LUT. The second one is where we use the one shot by DSC Labs to do a one-shot grade with the resolve feature. And then the last one is I do a manual grade. And we also time out the manual grade to see which one kind of gets us within the wheelhouse and how long it took us to get there. We start with the LUT grade. So what I first noticed with the LUT grade is no matter what I do, I am not crazy about Sony's nuclear oversaturated red and oranges. It's even internal. When you have Rec. 709 on internally, I just feel like you got to go into the camera and you got to really, really pull these reds and oranges down. And that's just sort of typical for Sony for me. When I apply the Canon LUT, I find it still quite undersaturated. Now, it is the official LUT provided by Canon, but there's a whole host of options with this LUT. But I think it does get us into the wheelhouse, and then from there you can kind of boost your saturation where you need it to be. Going into Vlog, I find it's pretty middle of the road. It grades pretty quickly, pretty easily, and gets us in the wheelhouse without any really standoutish colors or contrast shifts. The Blackmagic film, to me, grades the fastest and best with the LUT. So fastest out the gate is probably your Blackmagic, then your Vlog, then your Canon LUT, and then Sony is going to take you a little bit of work. Moving on to the one-shot grade. So this is a feature in Resolve that you can just do an overlay and it will use your one-shot card to calibrate the colors that were ingested and match them to what the color should be. With this, I found that Canon was wildly saturated now, almost too much, and so I really had to go in and pull back that saturation. Moving over to Vlog, I'm looking at polished skin tones and they look really great and realistic. Colors are not too toxic, it's kind of nice and mild, so I think it does a really great job there. So moving on to the Sony and S-Log3. With the S-Log3, I still struggle with the noise, but the colors aren't as toxic as they were with the 709 LUT, so it was really nice to be able to get it in the wheelhouse really quick with the one shot. And then finally moving on to the Blackmagic Film 4.6K, it grades really nice and super quick in Resolve with the one shot, which should be of no surprise to anybody. And finally, moving on to the manual grade. We're gonna first talk about how long each manual grade took me to sort of get to where I was happy with it. But I think what's important to mention here is that my monitor may not be calibrated. I'm on a MacBook Pro 15-inch, and your monitor may not be calibrated. So what looks good to me on my computer may look like absolute dog poo to you on your computer. But that being said, it's also a subjective process. So I got it to sort of where I liked it and where I was comfortable with it. If you were grading, you may have chosen to continue grading or you would have stopped earlier. But I think this gives you a roundabout idea of how you can reel in the colors and the contrast to get a pleasing image out of the log. So starting with Canon C-Log, it actually only took me about 4 minutes and 37 seconds to kind of get where I wanted it. But when I moved on to Panasonic Vlog, astoundingly, I shaved off 1.5 minutes of my time with 3 minutes and 8 seconds to get it into the wheelhouse. Sony S-Log3 has typically been my nemesis. It does include a lot of range, especially in the highlights, and to get that kind of comfortable takes a bit of massaging. But in this particular scene, this interior scene, I was able to actually get it graded where I was happy with it within 4 minutes and 15 seconds, so actually beating Canon, surprisingly enough. When I go outside and we show the highlights, trying to get a massaged image in a high contrast situation takes a little bit more work with S-Log, but it does really great and grades a lot quicker than I actually expected it to. Finally, moving on to Blackmagic Film, and to no one's surprise, 3 minutes and 14 seconds, grades super fast within Resolve. It's not a super aggressive logarithmic profile, so there's not as much work to be done, but it grades really, really nice and super fast. The other thing I think was worth mentioning is that when it comes to extreme highlights, the C-Log 3 is always something that really impressed me in terms of their highlight rendition and maintaining those highlights. C-Log originally was pretty terrible at that, but C-Log 3 is a really awesome profile. So I think the summary here is that all cameras grade pretty quick in their logarithmic profile, nothing too outrageous, and to not actually be afraid of Canon C200's 8-bit signal. It proves that it has a lot of power, and if you need extra horsepower, then certainly you can record to RAW, and there's a proxy feature as well with it. But generally speaking, they all work really, really well. I do encourage you to get like a one-shot chart or a Macbeth chart, that type of thing. That's really going to help get your colors in line in post-production. But all of them grade super fast, super well. So thumbs up to everyone. Moving on to low light and high ISO shooting. The big news here, of course, is with the EVA-1, which features a dual native ISO. They carried it over from the Panasonic VariCam and VariCam Lite line, and what it does is instead of boosting the signal at higher ISOs, it gives you two native ones at 800 and 2500 by offering two signals out of the sensor. So presumably, when you shoot at 2500 with this camera, it is going to give you a cleaner signal than by boosting the signals of these cameras to match. But that remains to be seen. Let's actually look at the footage and see how these cameras hold up. We are going to start at 800 ISO. It is sort of the base sensitivity that is shared by most of these cameras. The URSA, nice clean signal. They used to have problems with noise in the blue channel, and 800 wasn't very good. Firmware upgrades have since fixed that, so you're seeing a nice clean image. The FS5 has a nice clean image. The EVA has a high contrast 709 profile. It's a little bit distracting, but as you can see, it's got a nice clean image at the 800 base ISO. And then the C200, nice and clean at 800. Moving on to 1600, which is one stop above, we have the URSA, which is clean. I expected it actually to be much worse, so I'm very impressed with the 1600 on the URSA. The FS5, as expected, is quite clean. The EVA is also clean, and we're still staying to the 800 base here. We're just boosting the signal. And then moving on to the C200, again, quite clean. Instead of going to 3200 ISO, I've chosen to go to 2500 ISO, and that is because I want to match the second native sensor base of the EVA. Now, the URSA is out of contention because the URSA only goes up to 1600, so it's already out of the party. FS5 is nice and clean at 2500. The EVA, as can be expected, of course, is clean because this is its second native ISO. And then the C200 is also clean, relatively. So it's quite amazing to see that the FS5 and the C200 are clean even when they have a base sensitivity of a stop and a half below this. Moving on to 5000 ISO. The FS5, the noise begins to be perceivable, especially in the shadows. Moving on to the EVA, if you pixel peep, there is some noise, but it's like pretty slight. I mean, this is a very usable image. And you know, we sort of talk and we point fingers a lot at all these cameras and how good one is over the others at high ISOs. But you know, like I almost never shoot at 5000 ISO. And the fact that I can shoot at 5000 ISO now and have a relatively clean signal that I'm okay with is pretty miraculous. So, I mean, let's see where we go from 5000, but like already I'm dealing with cameras that can do what cameras couldn't even do like a couple years ago. So pretty amazing stuff. So moving on to the C200, it is impressively clean. And you have to remember, this is an 8-bit camera shooting at a native ISO of 800. So we're really boosting the signal here, and it looks pretty darn good. Moving on to 10,000 ISO, this of course is going to be where the rubber finally starts to hit the road, and it does in spades with the FS5, where we start to see a lot of the magenta and cyan macro blocking. And that is most apparent, of course, in the shadows. The EVA also starts to fall apart here. I noticed the macro blocking even in the midtones at 10,000 ISO. And to my surprise, again, the C200 is the best performer. Now the noise is there, but it's like a filmic grain structure. So I don't know what they're doing with that 8-bit signal and how they get such a nice image out of it, but like this is, while it is kind of grainy, is totally usable and actually looks kind of nice. So at 10,000 ISO, C200 takes the cake. And finally, we're going to do 20,000 ISO. We could go higher, but I think it's a moot point. 20,000 should get you the information you're after. When we look at it, the FS5 is pretty nasty. I would say emergency use only. The EVA is kind of the same as the FS5. Not really that great. A lot of apparent macro blocking. Break glass in case of emergency kind of thing. And finally, of course, we see that the C200 is also suffering. But again, that grain structure just feels better. So if I was actually to shoot in low light, I would say I would choose the C200 out of any of these cameras, bar none. Next up is autofocus. Now, autofocus has always been a bit of a novelty in the cinema camera market, but now that we're using photographic lenses on a lot of these cameras, as we are using here with the Canon L series, pulling focus with a photo lens is kind of a lesson in futility. So having good autofocus is actually pretty helpful. The second thing is we're putting all these cameras now on gimbals, especially like these 3 cameras here are awesome on really lightweight gimbals. You might need something a little bit beefier for the URSA Mini Pro. But generally speaking, having autofocus could be a huge advantage when you're doing gimbal work. I'm going to cut to the chase here. Canon's dual pixel autofocus just slaughters the field. It holds focus incredibly well, and it's got 2 different settings. One is face priority and face only. So with face priority, it really latches onto the face, but then as soon as the face is gone, it just finds the thing in the field that needs to be in focus, and when the face comes back, it grabs the face again. Really, really great. Now, Sony, of course, also has face tracking, but what I found is as soon as the face is gone, it totally freaks out. I will say, though, that with the Sony, it's a native E-mount lens system, so we've had to use a Metabones adapter in order to be able to use the EF lens. So maybe there's something with the EF and the Metabones that don't work as well with E. I didn't test it with E because I really wanted all the lenses to be identical. Moving on to the URSA Mini Pro and the EVA, both of those are one-shot autofocus, which means that they require you to touch a button when you need to acquire focus. In this situation, I think the EVA performs the best, where it acquires focus nice and smoothly. The URSA Mini Pro, not so much. It's pretty stuttery and sluggish, and that's no surprise for a camera that's really built and designed around controlled studio work. The next thing we want to look at is how slow can they go. Now, a lot of these cameras are capable of doing up to 200 or 240 frames a second, but we just wanted to test at 120, and I think that's an important number to test at because you're probably going to be using 120 or lower, and at 120, all these kind of operate a little bit differently. The EVA can do 120 at HD, but it has 2 modes. If you want to shoot either in a 2K mode, then you'll use the whole sensor. It doesn't get windowed or cropped. Whereas it also has a 4/3 mode, which will crop and will allow you to do frame rates higher than 120, up to 240. So again, for 120, we just chose the full sensor version. We didn't crop it in. The C200 also offers 120 at no crop. The FS5 will do 120 no crop. But there's 2 things you need to know about this. So one is, natively when you buy the camera, the 120 has to be buffered, which means that you record, and when you're done recording, it then takes it from the storehouse and starts encoding it onto the card, which means that you can't just hit record right away again, which kind of sucks. And then moving on to the URSA Mini Pro, it's the only one of the bunch that is heavily cropped. But you can work around that by shooting with wider lenses, but it's going to limit really how wide you can go. I will say this, that when we look at all of the footage from these cameras and we look at things like moire, we look at sort of any image artifacts that tend to happen with high frame rates, we don't see any of it. I think they all perform very, very well at 120 frames per second. We didn't test 240 frames, but again, at 120 and below, where you're likely to be using it most often, they all look really, really great. Okay, next up is handling and stability. I'm going to start with sort of the lightest cameras and moving to the heaviest cameras. Starting with the FS5, it's really amazing. They're designed to kind of be held like this in front of you, and they're great. The grip on it is awesome. It's With one click, I can just manipulate the handle. Feels really comfortable in my hand, and again, is a super light camera. It also has the servo buttons. If you have a servo lens on there, you can zoom in and out, which is awesome with this camera. And you would think that with a light camera like this, it would feel really bumpy and jittery, but tracking subjects with this wasn't so bad. It felt kind of light and easy to manipulate. And often when I'm tracking subjects, I want a heavier camera because they're less sort of bumpy, but you don't want them to be too heavy where you're starting to strain and shake. So this is a pretty nice camera for handheld. Moving on to the EVA-1. Now the EVA-1 feels very similar to the FS5. In fact, all of its sort of like buttons and everything in the handle is very similar to the FS5, but it feels a little bit stripped down. It doesn't have the servo toggles on it. But one of the things that's unique about this camera and the advantages of the 5.7K sensor is that it has an internal electronic image stabilization, which means that if you're using lenses that don't have image stabilization in them, it can provide a crop in on the 5.7 and then electronically stabilize. So we tested it first without the image stabilization, and no surprise, it was just like everybody else. But when you put it on, it works remarkably well. And so I would say, like, all things being equal, not using an image stabilized lens and just having to rely on internal, the EVA wins hands down for tracking super smoothly. Moving to the next camera, the C200, this immediately feels heavier. It immediately feels beefier, almost like a little stronger as well, but the hand grip isn't as contoured. So one of the things that I do notice about it, which is kind of cumbersome, is when you have to change the angle of the hand grip. There's not just a little button like there is with the FS5 or with the EVA. You actually have to spin this little wheel here, which is the same wheel you use to actually remove the hand grip, and then you kind of find your new position and then lock it back in again. I mean, not the end of the world, but it is a bit of a nuisance compared to the FS5 and the EVA. But it's a really nice, well-built camera. Just feels a little bit beefier and not as comfortable in the hand. Okay, and finally with the URSA Mini Pro. This is a bit of the black sheep in the lineup. What you see here doesn't necessarily come stock with the camera. You don't get this EVF with the camera, and that will take down some of the weight, of course, but the only way to power this guy is with brick V-mount batteries. And as a result, that's going to add a lot of weight. When we look at the ergonomics of it, the handle is very similar to that of the handle of the C200, but the camera itself is just so monstrous. Like, just holding it here right now is pretty strenuous. It's not really designed to be held like this. It needs to be on your shoulder or it needs to be on a tripod. This is not really what they want you to do with it, despite the fact that it has this handle. So again, in summary, I think really if you're doing a lot of handheld stuff like this, two choices. I think you got the EVA-1, which is amazing because it has that internal stability. So you can use things like cinema lenses or cinema zoom lenses that don't have internal image stabilization, and you'll get that with this camera, which is awesome. And then next up, I would actually say the Sony FS5. Great run and gun for dock stuff, handles really, really well. And now it's my favorite time of the program. It's the Dale's Rant Corner, otherwise known as analyzing and evaluating the LCD screens. So we'll start with the EVA. Originally, I really loved this hood. I thought it was ingenious, but once I took it outside, I got annoyed for two things. One is that the hood doesn't come off. It's like fixed on here. So you have to like kind of get your fingers around, and using the touchscreen felt a little bit annoying. But also the screen is super reflective. I had a really hard time seeing this screen in daylight. No matter what I did, whether I bumped up the brightness and contrast, I just couldn't see anything at all. I basically had to put a coat over top to be able to see what I need to see on the screen and to be able to get exposure. And that normally wouldn't be a problem because you could just go to the EVF, but there's no EVF. You can buy an aftermarket EVF for this camera, but again, we're trying to evaluate these cameras on not having to buy any aftermarket equipment. Going into the display of the EVA is both a blessing and a curse. First, it's a curse because the information that follows the trim of the screen is so tiny. If you have less than perfect eyesight, you're gonna have a real hard time finding what you need on that LCD. But when you move into this function that happens when you press the home button, you get a heads-up display of some of the most important settings you can access with touchscreen. And those are like really nice and big, and I really love the layout. It actually reminds me of a Varicam layout, so really, really nice. But the overall display settings on it, I'm totally not impressed with. Now with the Canon, I haven't loved the screens on Canon cameras before. They've been really reflective as well, and I've had a hard time seeing them in daylight. But with this particular camera, it seems to be much improved, and I can see it a lot better in bright sunlight than I used to be able to. But what I really love about Canon design is how they put all these hot buttons right on the screen itself. And so I've got a joystick, I've got function, I've got menu, I've got all these really great things that I need quick access to that I don't have to go to the camera body to access. And plus you also have touchscreen focus with the screen itself. So it's a really, really great product, and I think it's an awesome step forward for Canon. Moving on to the FS5, there's nothing I can mechanically critique about the LCD screen other than it's a little bit smaller than everybody else's, but that didn't seem to really be an issue for me. What I really have a hard time with is the fact that this camera doesn't have a waveform monitor. The FS7 does, and this one doesn't. So you're relegated to histogram and zebras. Yes, you can easily get log exposure and Rec 709 exposure or whatever with both of those functions, but it's a little bit more cumbersome and it fills up your screen and all this sort of stuff where a waveform monitor would be great to have. And finally, moving on to the URSA Mini Pro. It's got this great fold-out touchscreen and a bunch of really cool stuff to access on the outside as well. And bonus points for having this LCD screen here, which you can read in like a variety of lighting conditions. Super, super important to have. But the touchscreen is super awesome, and you can control most of what you need to control this camera via the touchscreen without having to like get your finger around the LCD and that kind of thing. So it's got like false color and all these things, and it's just like one click away from getting it, which is super, super awesome. There are, however, two things I don't like about that. Number one is, as I discovered, in cold temperatures, it doesn't recognize my finger at all. So the touchscreen becomes almost useless in cold temperatures. And then the next thing that really bugs me about this is that it's the only viewfinder that doesn't rotate 180 degrees. Why that matters is that if you are a single operator and you shoot a lot of corporate stuff, a lot of doc interviews, what you want to be able to do is you want to put your camera on your tripod, flip the screen towards the subject, and then sit in the subject's chair so that you can do all your lighting and composition ahead of the subject's arrival. But without being able to do that, you're going to need a secondary monitor, which again, we're trying not to add accessories. So the winner for me really comes down to Canon. I think Canon got everything right and is sort of the best of both worlds when it comes to the LCD and also having an EVF as well in challenging lighting conditions. Okay, really quickly before we wrap up, I want to talk about layout. Layout is actually really, really important to me. It may not be as important to you, but when time is money on set, you want to be familiar with the layout of your camera so you can make really, really quick choices and quick decisions when you need to, like changing white balance, changing all of your camera settings, all that type of thing on the fly. You want to move really, really quickly. And some cameras I find are better than others at their layout. My least favorite is Sony. No matter which Sony camera I use, whether it's an F55, an FS7, or the FS5, I don't love the way it's laid out. It all kind of feels a bit confusing. That being said, once I'm shooting with the camera long enough, I do get used to it, and a lot of things do become intuitive. But the race to intuitiveness is the longest with the Sony, I find. There's a couple things I love about the FS5. I love that you can S&Q on it, so you can get to high frame rates really quick. You can get to your profiles really quick, your picture profiles, and the status here is linked to your audio channels. So you get a big heads-up display of your audio channels, and I really love that. So I use that a lot with this camera. And then as well with the variable ND, it's the only camera that has a variable ND, so you can really dial in specifics about the amount of neutral density that you want on your camera. The next up would probably be the EVA. I really like the EVA. I think it's pretty simple. There were a couple confusing things for me at first, but like Canon, they really strip it down. They don't give you a whole lot of stuff on here. They only give you the bare essentials, but they give you the ones that you need the most, like quick access to the waveform monitor, quick access to image stabilization, and all those types of things. So it's all like really right there in my hand. I would imagine if I was shooting with this camera for a long time, I wouldn't even have to look anymore. I could basically just dial it in on the go, and I can move pretty quickly. There were a few things that I had to go into the camera to change into the settings, which kind of was a little bit annoying, but that's the price you pay for having a stripped down body. Then moving on, next is the URSA Mini Pro. Again, I mentioned this just previously. I love the LCD. That's touchscreen, so in good weather conditions, you've got a great touchscreen which you can access 90% of what you need. And if you don't have that, you can access pretty much everything on the inside and on the outside. But what I don't like is how I have to always kind of like move this and reach around to kind of get to my iris and to my buttons, and I can't really see. This is a great camera if it's on your shoulders, because the idea is it's all right here and you can see all this. But when it's on sticks or in front of you, it's a little bit more cumbersome. Last but not least is the Canon. I have very little complaints about the Canon. It is my favorite. They do change their buttons from camera to camera. So when you go from the C300 to the C100 to the C200, they all have the same functions, but they're all kind of in different places. So if you're used to one and you come to the other, you're a bit mixed up. But then you kind of find your charm and you know where everything is and you get really used to it, which is great. So you can just kind of feel around. If I shoot with this camera long enough, I know where the ISO is, I know where the waveform monitor is, and I can just kind of feel it out, and that's really great. So they don't give you a cluster of buttons, they give you, again, like the EVA, the most important ones. And on set, time is money, and having a camera that you can operate really, really quick is often even more important than having a certain type of image quality. All right, so in conclusion, we're not looking for the one camera that does it all. We're looking to pair the right camera with the type of workflow that is most important to you. So if you are doing commercial work or VFX work, then you want the power of an internal RAW recording camera like the C200 or the URSA Mini Pro. If you're doing broadcast or run and gun work, you're going to be way better suited by getting the FS5 or the EVA-1. Now, of course, these cameras can record RAW externally, but again, we're trying to avoid adding external stuff to these cameras. And that's about it. So thanks so much for watching. As always, subscribe to our channel and comment in the comment section below. I left out a lot of things that I would have loved to have talked about, but we just don't have the time. So I'm really interested for you to share your thoughts and experiences with these cameras and start a conversation in our comment section, because I think that's really, really valuable to the community. And that's about it. So go out there, try one of these guys out, have a lot of fun, and happy shooting.